Before we dive in, I'd like to ask a small favor. I'm pouring all my energy into reaching my goal of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to me. Please, I'm asking you to hit that subscribe button. It's just a single click, but it gives me tremendous motivation to keep creating more videos. Thank you so much.
Lady Marbre's smile, aimed at the Duke of Ravensgate, was a carefully orchestrated performance, as was the almost imperceptible pinch she delivered to her niece's arm simultaneously. Neither gesture was meant to be truly seen for what it was. The smile, warm and radiant, belonged to a hostess who had orchestrated the season's grandest event and now anticipated a very specific, public reward. The pinch, however, was a sharp, small jab delivered discreetly beneath the loose folds of Diana's brown sleeve, near the elbow. It was a practiced move, honed over 7 years, carrying a silent, urgent message: more hot water, and be quick about it, and disappear from the room without a word. Diana rose from the low tea tray with an almost preternatural silence and picked up the silver kettle. She offered a curtsy to the assembled company, a gesture as perfunctory as acknowledging a wall, and then she was gone. No one tracked her departure. In fact, her entire purpose that afternoon was to be overlooked. She was 24, a slender figure in a day gown the color of rust brown, its hem lowered twice and its cuff refashioned once. Her face was pale and serious, framed by dark, finely drawn brows that arched over somber gray eyes. Her hair, pinned severely beneath a plain cap, lent her an air of a woman a decade her senior. Had anyone truly looked at her hands, they would have noticed them first. They were quick, deft, and steady, the hands of a musician, though in that drawing room no one could have guessed it. For 7 years, she had been forbidden to play. Instead, she had mastered the art of serving tea to 200 guests a season, without spilling a single drop. This was Diana Cranage, daughter of the elder sister of the woman who had just pinched her. Both her parents were gone. Her inheritance, secured by law and a settlement she'd never seen since she was 17, amounted to a meager 180 pounds a year for life. She had never touched a shilling of it. Her reality had been confined to the dim interiors of Lady Marbre's linen cupboard and ledgers, and the cramped back schoolroom where the youngest Marbre daughter was tutored in Latin by a girl who wasn't even permitted to join the family at dinner. Her errand for hot water would be a silent one. The pinch, a faint red bruise beneath her sleeve by supper, would remain unseen, just as every pinch from Lady Marbre had always been. The Marbre residence on Mount Street was tall, narrow, and impeccably elegant, a testament to its mistress's precise nature. Everything within its walls was correct, and everything was for show. The gilt on the drawing room ceiling was fresh, while the paint on the servants' stairs peeled, and the cook hadn't been paid in 3 months. The 3 Marbre daughters, dressed in the 3rd latest fashion each season, were presented with such artful management that discerning eyes in Mayfair would detect no difference. Lady Marbre, Cosma, was the widow of Sabertram Marbre. He had died within 4 years of their marriage, leaving her with 3 infant daughters, a modest fortune, and a name he had presumed she would wield with gentleness. She had wielded it instead as a weapon, solely to equip her daughters for a marriage market she herself had failed to conquer. Her failure stemmed from a single reason: she had been the younger of 2 daughters. Her elder sister, beautiful and serene, had married a penniless scholar whom she adored. Cosma had watched this union from the periphery for 11 years. Then, a harsh winter claimed her sister's life, followed 6 months later by the scholar. Cosma attended her sister's funeral, a vision in a fine black bonnet, and returned with the daughter. Diana had arrived at her aunt's house at 17, cloaked in the somber black of a girl mourning both parents. Her sole possessions were a small trunk containing the 3 books her father had refused to part with, and a single, meticulously folded piece of paper. There were no jewels, no music, though her mother had taught her the pianoforte before the instrument at Ellalee had been sold along with everything else. The paper was a copy, made by her father's clerk in his final week, of the crucial clause in her mother's marriage settlement. On that first evening, her aunt had taken the paper. "Such documents should be kept safe," Cosma had said, her tone deceptively kind. "I shall keep it for you," with the original the executor sent. She had opened a small escritoire, placed both papers inside, turned the tiny brass key, and spoken no more of the matter for 7 years. By the end of that first evening, Diana had understood. The daughter of a scholar, she was no fool. She grasped that the settlement provided £180 annually, drawn from a trust established by her mother's uncle. She also understood that asking her aunt for it would result in her immediate expulsion from the house, leaving her to the precarious fate of a governess with no references. She knew her aunt would quietly appropriate the funds, labeling them as ward expenses. No one at the trust office would question an orphan under the care of a respectable widow in Mount Street. Her decision was made that night in the cold of the small back bedroom assigned to her at 17. She would stay. She would eat what was provided and earn her keep in whatever way was demanded. She kept the copy of the settlement, tucked discreetly within the cover of the smallest of her 3 books, unsure if her aunt even knew of its existence. She would wait. For what, she couldn't articulate. Initially, she thought she waited for her aunt's death, but then she observed her aunt's robust health, anticipating another 20 years. Then, she hoped for a friend, but her aunt allowed few companions. Later, she envisioned a quiet employment, some small opportunity that might blossom. Yet, her aunt intercepted every letter. Finally, she ceased waiting for anything specific and simply endured. This quiet resilience, the plainest form of courage, went unnoticed and unthanked, yet it was the very engine of the world. Now, she was 24. The youngest Marbre daughter was nearing 19, having been out since the previous spring. Cosima now found herself with all 3 daughters unmarried and, consequently, began to act. Her strategy that spring was precise and cunning. She penned a letter to her late husband's second cousin, a woman she hadn't bothered to know for 20 years, who had, rather fortunately, married well. This cousin was the Dowager Duchess of Ravensgate. The dowager, elderly and gravely ill, possessed a son of 32, still unmarried, whom she was determined to see settled before her death. Cosima's letter was a masterpiece of subtle artifice. It made no mention of her daughters. It merely requested a small, discreet visit during the season, as a great favor, and inquired if her son might be persuaded to accompany her. The dowager accepted. She accepted because she was dying, and because she wished, before departing, to survey every eligible young woman of good birth her son might consider, and to form her own judgment. She explained this plainly to her son over his medicine. He bowed his head and replied, "Very well, mother." He agreed because his mother was fading and asked so little, and because, in all matters not concerning his own dignity, he was an exceptionally good son. This was Ellis, Duke of Ravensgate, at 32. He had inherited the title at 27 upon the sudden death of his father in a hunting accident. The ensuing 5 years had been spent in the House of Lords and within the vast, decaying pile of South Cross in Kent, where he was learning the true cost of his inheritance. South Cross was crumbling. Its roof had been overdue for replacement for a decade. His father had neglected the farms in favor of his hounds. The tenants were weary. His steward was exhausted, his mother was dying, and he himself was bone-tired of the polite machinations of every Mayfair woman, with a marriageable daughter and a living mother. He was tall, with a face that others described as cold, and his few close friends simply called tired. His eyes, a deep, dark brown, appeared almost black in candlelight. His hair was raven black. He dressed impeccably, always in dark colors, for he had no patience for the flamboyant attire of men his age. In public, he was a serious young man of the reforming faction. In private, a young man who had stepped directly from his father's funeral into a world of responsibility, denied the simple luxury of grief. He had come to Mount Street that afternoon at his mother's behest. He had brought her carriage, helped her up the shallow steps, and offered Cosima Marbre a perfectly correct bow and the appropriate pleasantries. Then, he sat and commenced the polite, excruciating ritual of being presented to the three Marbre daughters. They were seated in a row, a deliberate arrangement by Cosima. The eldest was positioned furthest away, her beauty intended to unfold gradually like a fine painting. The youngest sat near the fire, as a touch of warmth brought a faint color to her cheeks. The middle daughter was placed between them, wearing a gown Cosima had artfully refashioned from the eldest's discarded gown from the previous winter. Cosima gave little thought to Alice, having never quite divined a purpose for her. Priscilla was 26. She was the beauty, and had been since 17. 6 seasons had passed, and no advantageous offer had materialized. This fact, Cosima carefully ensured, was never spoken aloud in the house. Priscilla possessed golden hair, an alabaster throat, and a signature tilt of her head that had captivated Almax the season she debuted. In the intervening years, she had learned to smile with minimal lip movement, as a smile that contorted her upper lip was less becoming. She possessed a sharp, narrow intelligence, the kind that believes certain things are owed to her. At 10, she had decided she would be a duchess, and at 26, she was still resolutely pursuing that goal. Beneath the veneer of beauty lay a subtle, almost imperceptible weariness, a vulnerability a discerning eye might detect. She was not cruel, but she was afraid, raised for a singular purpose, and with that purpose yet unfulfilled, the fear of failure gnawed at her from within, like a silent, persistent gnawing. Alice was 22, the middle daughter, and decidedly not the beauty. She had brown hair, a plain, kind face, and eyes the color of tea. She read whenever she could acquire books. In that house, she was Diana's quiet ally, though both were careful to maintain an appearance of distant acquaintance. When Diana was unwell, Alice would surreptitiously bring her a cup of broth via a back staircase. When Alice was frightened, Diana would discreetly hold her hand beneath the table. These were small gestures, yet they often meant everything. Jemima, 19, was the youngest. She had been presented for 1 season and, by all indications, would remain so for several more. She was a giggling, easily influenced girl who mimicked Priscilla's demeanor in every room, finding it safer than forging her own. Unbeknownst to her family, she possessed a genuine gift for languages. Diana had taught her Latin, as Cosima deemed it useless for a girl and refused to hire a tutor. Now, Jemima quietly read Virgil in the schoolroom each morning, a secret she kept from her mother. Into this carefully constructed tableau, at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday in early May, the Duke of Ravensgate arrived. He sat opposite the row of daughters. Offered tea, he accepted, and Cosima, who had so meticulously arranged the seating, had orchestrated one further detail. She had ordered Diana to pour. Diana was positioned at a low tray by the wall, her back partially turned to the company. Her role was to pour tea, attend to the footmen, and fetch hot water when signaled. She was to speak to no one, to be introduced to no one. In the afternoon's carefully planned composition, she was to be the negative space, the backdrop against which her cousin's qualities would be highlighted. She was there to occupy the role of the impoverished, plainly dressed dependent, a woman tethered to an aunt as famously generous as Cosima Marbre. Cosima had laid this out for Diana that very morning in 3 curt sentences that left no room for argument. Diana had understood. In truth, Diana had been primed to understand from the tender age of 17 and had been paying close attention ever since. She returned with the hot water, refilling the teapot at the low-slung tray. She settled back, her small, pale hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the tea service rather than the Duke. For 7 years, she had schooled herself not to look at male visitors. It simply made things easier for everyone. The Duke had noticed her. He'd noticed her at the precise moment of the pinch. He hadn't seen the pinch itself, not directly. He'd seen Diana's shoulder twitch a minuscule fraction, and her face freeze for a fleeting instant. He'd watched her rise, and had seen the footman move to open the door for her, only to be waved away because Cosima didn't want anyone opening doors for the less fortunate. He'd watched her depart without a word. He had noticed something else, too, though he couldn't yet articulate what. He had observed that the three young ladies, when they spoke as if they had been meticulously rehearsed. Priscilla answered questions with sentences as artfully arranged as flower baskets. Jemima punctuated the ends of Priscilla's sentences with laughter. Alice stared at her lap. There was nothing inherently wrong with any of it. Yet, there was nothing in any of it that a serious man might build a life upon. He answered the questions posed to him. He, in turn, asked the polite ones. Cosima regaled him at length with Priscilla's accomplishments. He heard of a screen Priscilla had painted, a song she had learned, a shawl she had knotted for a favored cousin. He was informed that Priscilla was greatly admired at Almack's. He nodded gravely. Turning to Alice, he inquired if she read. Alice replied softly that she did. He then addressed Jemima, asking what she had been reading lately. Jemima, with a nervous glance at her mother, announced a novel by Miss Edgeworth. In reality, she hadn't been reading a novel by Miss Edgeworth at all. She had been poring over Virgil in a quiet corner of the schoolroom, guided by Diana's finger, but she had learned early on not to reveal such things. Kuma was pleased. She felt the afternoon was proceeding as well as any first tea could be expected to. She hadn't seen the Duke's face when Diana rose. In orchestrating her drawing room tableau, her attention was entirely focused on the front row. That was the design of the afternoon. It was also its foundation. The Duke stayed for the full, customary half-hour. He drank 2 cups and offered a brief compliment on the tea. He said nothing at all about the young ladies. He bowed to his mother and assisted her to her feet. In the hall, as he waited for his cane, Diana passed behind him once, carrying a tray. He turned his head ever so slightly, but did not speak. She did not look up. Then she was gone. In the carriage, he remained silent for a long moment. His mother, quite accustomed to his silences, offered no comment. At last he spoke quietly. "Not Priscilla," his mother stated. "No." She said it with the same finality one uses to refuse a bolt of cloth one does not want. "Nor the youngest." "No," she continued. "The middle one is a good girl. She is." The dowager adjusted her rug over her thin knees. "She is not, however, the girl you need." He did not reply for several minutes. Then he said, "There is a niece, a dependent." His mother remained silent. "Pouring tea," he added, "in brown." The Dowager Duchess of Ravensgate turned her head at last and regarded her son. She was a small, worn woman with keen eyes and the delicate bone structure of someone who had been beautiful a very long time ago. "I know you saw her," she said. "I saw her when we came in the hall, straightening the flowers." She paused. "Her name is Cranage." He nodded once, not bothering to ask his mother how she knew. His mother had, during her illness, made it a habit to learn the names of every young woman in every house she visited, so that when her son finally mentioned one, she would already possess some knowledge of her. It was a small task she had undertaken silently for a year. "Well," he said after a moment, "that is at least an afternoon not entirely wasted. Ellis," his mother's voice was very soft, "do not raise her up only to set her down. Not that girl." "I do not raise anyone, mother." "You do," his mother insisted. "You cannot help it. It is your title. Take care." He inclined his head and offered no response. The carriage continued its journey down Mount Street, bathed in the gentle afternoon light. Inside the tall, narrow house, Cosima Marbre was already informing her eldest daughter that the Duke had called. She spoke with the small, pleased tone of a woman who had meticulously laid her groundwork. A second visit would follow, and Priscilla was to be prepared. Priscilla was delighted. Jimmer was pleased for her, and Alice sat with her hands in her lap, saying nothing. Upstairs, in the schoolroom at the very top of the house, Diana Cranage sat down at the plain desk where she taught Jemima her Latin. She slipped her hand beneath her sleeve, pressing the small, warm spot near her elbow, and thought of nothing at all. At 17, she had learned not to dwell on the pinches. It was her sole defense. She had remained safe at the conclusion of every afternoon, so long as she did not allow herself to think about them, and she had been safe for 7 years. She did not know that on that particular afternoon, she had been observed. She would not have believed it if she had been told. The second call arrived 3 days later. It came under the guise of a small, polite pretext. The Duke, he explained, had promised his mother he would call again to inquire after Lady Marbre's health, which, he recalled, had been described as somewhat indifferent at their previous meeting. Kumair had not, in fact, stated her health was indifferent. She had mentioned her nerves were sometimes troubled, but she was not the sort of woman to refuse the stage the Duke was offering her. Within a quarter of an hour, she was in the drawing room, sporting a new cap. Priscilla was in the drawing room within the half hour, resplendent in a new gown. Jemima was tucked away in a corner. Alice was perched on the sofa, and Diana was upstairs, teaching the youngest child of the housekeeper, Jemima's cast-off Latin lesson, a task she had performed every other afternoon for 4 years. Kuma had considered this arrangement quite secure. The Duke, after all, had come to see her daughters, and would hardly think to inquire after a niece. She had underestimated him, in the same common way that women who have never encountered a serious man tend to underestimate serious men. The Duke had, in truth, come to observe Diana. He would not have admitted this, even if pressed. He told himself he had come to learn a little more about the household. He had come to ascertain whether the drawing-room arrangement remained as it had been, whether the tea was once again poured by a poor relation in brown, whether the young ladies were seated in the same order. He had come, he told himself, to be thorough. He was shown in. He bowed, sat, and accepted his tea, this time from Priscilla's own hand. He uttered the appropriate pleasantries regarding Lady Marbre's health and allowed Priscilla to speak. She spoke eloquently. She described a lecture on antiquities she had recently attended and a small watercolor of a Roman ruin she had recently painted. She did not once pose a question of her own. His gaze briefly flickered to the mantelpiece. There lay a small volume, half concealed behind a china dog. "Are you a reader of Latin, Miss Marbre?" he inquired. Priscilla, too well trained to falter, replied sweetly that she read a little, very little. She could not, of course, read Virgil at sight. Nobody could. "One of my sisters," the Duke said mildly, "when I was a boy, learned it quite well from our mother. It is not, I have always thought, a language reserved solely for men." Priscilla smiled and agreed wholeheartedly. But, she added lightly, there had not been the opportunity in her own girlhood to learn. Her governesses had been more preoccupied with accomplishments. It was such a pity. Cosima nodded gently. The Duke said nothing, his gaze shifting to Alice. Alice's cheeks were flushed pink, and she was studying her hands. "And your other sister, Mother?" he asked casually, referring to the youngest. "Does she read Latin?" Coomer laughed, a small, dismissive sound she employed to close a topic. She declared Jemima to be hopelessly indolent with any book. She had attempted, she said, to have Jemima tutored, but it had proven utterly futile. She spoke this loudly enough for Jemima to hear, and Jemima's eyes dropped to the carpet. "Miss Jemima," the Duke said gently, "what is your favorite Latin author?" A hushed silence fell. Jemima's ears grew hot. She cast a quick, sideways glance at her mother's face, then towards the door. It was as though she were performing a small calculation. Diana was upstairs and could not rescue her. Priscilla could not rescue her. No one could. For the first time in her life, she had been directly addressed by a Duke. "Virgil, your Grace," she whispered. Cosima's expression remained unchanged. She had not been trained by any tutor. She had been trained by her own long practice, and her long practice held firm. "Ah, Which book? The Duke inquired. The fourth of the Aeneid, Jemima replied, still very softly. Sir, she corrected herself, Your Grace. He inclined his head and remarked, That is a difficult one. She looked down at her lap and said nothing. He turned to Cosma with an expression of polite, mild surprise and said, Mother, I stand corrected. Your daughter is more accomplished than you allow. Cosima recovered quickly. With a small, warm laugh, she remarked that Jemima had indeed dabbled in a little Latin with the last governess. She had almost forgotten. The last governess, she added lightly, had been quite fond of the ancient languages. Poor woman. She had died last autumn. Diana, in fact, had not been Jemima's governess. Cosmer had never hired a Latin tutor, and there had been no last governess. The Duke, who possessed 4 sisters and had known several governesses intimately, did not press the matter. He nodded gravely and allowed the moment to pass. But he had seen the calculation. He had seen Jemima's quick, sideways glance at her mother and observed her ears turn hot. He noted silently that there had to be, somewhere in that house, a Latin book that had been carefully studied, and someone patient who had guided that study. It was not Priscilla, it was not the mother. He waited. The conversation then turned to the current season. Priscilla was once again vivacious, light, and clever. Cosma expertly steered the conversation toward a few pieces of good family news. The Duke drank his tea. In due course, he rose to depart. He bowed to the ladies, and on his way to the door, his gaze briefly fell upon the sofa table, where a small household ledger lay open. He closed it himself. He had not touched it. He had merely glanced. The handwriting within was exceptionally fine. It was small and even, and distinctly not the hand of any of the 3 daughters with whom he had spent the hour. It resembled the hand of a woman who had managed a household's accounts for a considerable time. He offered his farewells and departed. In the carriage back to Grosvenor Square, he was quiet once more. When he finally spoke to his mother, he asked, Only the middle one? After a moment, he added, And the 4th? His mother replied, The 4th? There is a 4th young woman in that house, mother. She teaches Jemima her Latin. She keeps the accounts. His mother said, Ah, so it is she. He offered no reply. He returned a 3rd time, and a 4th, over the following fortnight. He came with his mother, and he came alone. He arrived in the mornings and in the afternoons. He posed questions about the house. Once he inquired if he might see the small garden at the rear, which Cosma had casually mentioned was newly planted with roses. Cosma sent Priscilla out with him. Priscilla walked with him along the paths, detailing at length the name of each plant. She knew none of them. She had learned the names from the plan the day before. He listened gravely. He inquired in a gentle tone if the roses were Diana's handiwork. Priscilla's step faltered not. She replied with a faint, light laugh that Diana, bless her heart, had lent a small hand. Indeed, everyone in the household offered a little assistance in the garden. She was quite fond of Diana. The Duke remarked, I don't believe I've had the pleasure of an introduction to Miss Cranage. Priscilla responded sweetly that of course he had. He had met Diana at tea 3 weeks prior. Diana had been serving. She was such a dear soul, but exceedingly shy, and she preferred not to be formally introduced to guests. She was, poor thing, a trifle intimidated by company. It was, Priscilla explained, the peculiarity of her circumstances. They all felt so for her. The Duke uttered, I see. He said it in a tone his mother would have instantly recognized. His mother knew that voice. It was the voice her son employed in the Lords, when a speaker had uttered a blatant falsehood cloaked in elegant prose, and it was not yet opportune to call him out. He did not press the matter, nor did he, on this 3rd visit, insist on seeing Diana. He bid farewell to Kuma and the sisters and departed. But that night, from Grosvenor Square, he penned a brief note in his own hand and had it delivered at 8 in the morning by a footman he trusted to the Mount Street residence. The note was addressed to Miss Cranage, care of Lady Marbre, and tucked within its outer envelope was a smaller note, not to be given to Lady Mary. The outer note stated courteously that His Grace, the Duke of Ravensgate, hoped to have the pleasure of being introduced to Miss Cranage on his next call, should her aunt be persuaded to facilitate the introduction. It was a polite, public missive. Kuma read it, naturally, over Diana's shoulder, and offered her small hostess smile. She remarked without warmth that Diana would have to be introduced. There was no avoiding it, but she was, of course, to speak very little, and nothing at all about the household or her position. The inner note read, in a smaller script, "If you can walk in the garden tomorrow at 10, I will be there. Come with the spaniel and a book. Say nothing of this to anyone." Diana reread it 3 times over the plain pine table in the schoolroom. The footman who had delivered it was long gone, and no one had seen her open the inner paper. She sat with it in her hand, and understood swiftly and coldly that she now faced a choice she had not sought. She could burn it. If she burned it, nothing would change, and she would continue as before. In 3 weeks or a month, when it became clear the Duke had no intention of pursuing Priscilla, Cosima would turn her rage inward upon the household, and Diana would bear the brunt of it for the summer. She had weathered worse summers. She would endure another, or she could go into the garden at 10 o'clock in the morning with the spaniel and a book. She could speak with the Duke of Ravensgate. She could give him whatever it was he desired from her. When Kuma discovered it, as Cosima inevitably would, she would be turned out of the house within the day, with no references and virtually no money. She had folded it very small, inside the book of Virgil her father had given her. One piece of paper she had never shown anyone, but she was not certain that piece of paper would suffice. She was not sure it would even be believed. She sat for a long time in the schoolroom, the note in her hand. She contemplated with perfect clarity what she had, in truth, been waiting for these past 7 years. She had been waiting for this. She had not known she was waiting for this, or for anything at all, but when she picked up the note, she had felt along the entire length of her spine the small, distinct tremor of a decision she had made long ago and had never allowed herself to acknowledge. She placed the outer note in the sewing basket for Cosima to discover later and consigned the inner note to the fire, watching it vanish. She rose and descended the stairs and informed Cosima, in her unadorned voice, that she intended to take the spaniel into the garden in the morning for exercise. Kuma did not look up from her writing. She replied without warmth that she might. At 10 o'clock, Diana went out with the spaniel, the small volume of Virgil tucked beneath her arm. She wore the same brown gown. She had changed nothing and made no effort to appear attractive. She had gone out looking precisely as she had at tea. She had done this deliberately, having considered it and decided that if the Duke of Ravensgate wished to speak with her, he would speak to the person she was. He would not speak to a woman she had fabricated for him. She was too weary for that, and in her own way, too proud. He was in the garden, at the far end, by the small brick wall where the roses struggled. He wore a plain dark coat and no hat. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing at the wall as if reading it. He did not turn as she approached. He said, "Miss Cranage," she replied. "Your Grace." He inquired, "Will you walk?" She answered, "I have 5 minutes." He responded, "Then we shall walk for 5 minutes." He positioned himself to her right, at the proper polite distance. The spaniel trotted ahead, sniffing. Diana carried the Virgil. He said, very quietly, "I have asked to speak with you plainly. Is that agreeable?" She replied, "Yes." He continued, "I know that you manage the accounts in that house. I know you have taught the youngest sister her Latin, and that you were not permitted to sit at tea." She remained silent. He added, "I also know I have no right to ask you the question I am about to pose, but if you are willing to answer, I would be grateful." She looked at her hands resting on the little book. She said, "Ask." He then asked, "Are you kept in that house against your will?" She considered for a long moment. Then she said, "No." He nodded once. She continued, and this was the harder part to articulate. "I stay because I have nowhere better to go, and because my aunt possesses papers that are rightfully mine, and which I cannot retrieve from her without legal intervention." He did not turn his head, continuing to walk at her pace. He asked, "What sort of papers?" She explained, "My mother's marriage settlement. It contains a small annuity of £180 per year. That is mine. My aunt has been receiving it for 7 years and has never given me a shilling. She holds the original document. I possess a copy of the crucial clause, but only a copy. My father's clock made it for me the week before he died." He walked another dozen paces before speaking. He remarked, "That is a serious accusation, Miss Cranage." She acknowledged, "I am aware. It is why I have never spoken of it to anyone." He then asked, "Do you tell me this because you wish me to act upon it?" She stopped walking. The spaniel returned and looked at her. She replied, "I do not know why I am telling you. I have confided in no one for 7 years. Perhaps I am weary, and perhaps you are the first person who has inquired." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "May I retain what you have just told me?" She responded, "I would prefer you did not inform my aunt." He assured her, "I will not tell your aunt. I will tell my mother. My mother has an excellent solicitor, and I would like, with your permission, to place that man at your disposal, discreetly, at no cost to you. He will do nothing without your instruction." For the first time, Diana looked directly at him. His dark eyes were not cold. They were weary in precisely the way she was weary, and steady. He was not smiling. She had begun, very cautiously, to trust him. She said, "You may." He nodded once. "Thank you," he said. She then asked, "Your Grace, may I ask you a question?" He replied, "Please." She inquired, "Why did you come today?" He was quiet and looked again at the wall. Finally, he said, "Because I have visited many houses this season, and yours is the first in which I have encountered a person I would trust to keep me sane." She looked at him. "That is not a small thing to say," she remarked. He countered, "It is not a small thing to mean." She stated, "You do not know me." He replied, "No, I know a hand in a household ledger. I know a girl who secretly tutored her cousin in the 4th book of the Aeneid. I know a young woman who endured a slight in her aunt's drawing room and never uttered a word." His voice became briefly, very soft. "It is enough to know that I wish to know more," she cautioned. "You have very little time before my aunt sees us from the window." He then asked, "Then allow me to pose my one direct question. May I call again? Not on your aunt, but on you." She was silent for a moment. In her entire life, she had never been asked such a question, nor had she, 7 years prior, ever expected to be. She replied, "I have no drawing room. I have no receiving day. If you wish to see me, you must contrive it." He assured her, "I can contrive." She then said, "Then yes." She spoke the word plainly and precisely, once. She turned then, because the spaniel was pulling toward the house, and did not curtsy as she was walking. She proceeded back up the path with her book, in her plain brown gown, the dog trotting a step ahead. The Duke of Ravensgate stood at the end of the path for a little while, looking not at her, but at the small brick wall where the roses did not thrive. He was not a young fool. He knew with absolute clarity that he had just done something men of his station were not meant to do. He had just silently committed himself to a course of action that would culminate in a marriage with a woman his mother's second cousin had taken considerable pains to conceal from him. He knew that Cosima Marbre would fight him for it, and he knew he would prevail. He did not know how dearly the woman with the small book would pay for his victory. He walked back through the side gate and emerged onto Mount Street, and did not, that afternoon, call formally at Lady Marbre's front door. Kuma, at the drawing-room window, had seen him leave the garden. She had not seen him enter. From her vantage point, she had only glimpsed the last of him, his tall, dark coat receding down the street. She had found it peculiar, and had inquired of Priscilla if the Duke had been in the garden. Priscilla, who had been engaged in her needlework in her own room, had replied that she did not know. Cosima had stated sharply that Diana was to come to her at once. Diana arrived and said she had walked the spaniel in the garden as arranged and had seen no one. She spoke this in her unadorned voice. Cosima regarded her for a long minute. She could not quite discern if Diana was being untruthful. In 7 years, she had never caught Diana in a lie. She had observed that Diana often said very little rather than resort to falsehood. She said at last, coldly, that Diana was to remain out of the garden until further notice. Diana replied softly that she would, curtsied, and went upstairs. That afternoon, in the schoolroom, she tutored Jemima in her Latin as usual. She did not mention the garden to anyone. For 8 days thereafter, nothing at all seemed to occur. The Duke did not call at Mount Street. He was seen twice at Almack's, both times in the company of his mother, and on both occasions he stood by a wall, engaged in polite conversation, and did not dance. Cosima, at Almack's, presented Priscilla to him in a small, deliberate manner. He bowed, offered his good evening, and did not ask Priscilla to dance. He turned to converse with an older gentleman of the reforming set and did not turn back. Cosima returned home in a rather vexed mood. However, she was unaware of his activities during the day. During those days, he was with his mother's solicitor, Mr. Pedet, in a small, quiet office in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Mr. Pedet was a spare, pale man of 55, with a mouth like a dry seal. He had served the Ravensgate family for 28 years and had never in his life countenanced a lie. He listened gravely to the Duke's account. When the Duke finished, he inquired if he might send a boy to the trust office at Chancery Lane for a copy of the settlement. The Duke agreed. The boy went and returned. By the second day of the 8, Mr. Pedet possessed all the necessary documentation in his small office. He had obtained a certified copy of the entire marriage settlement of Diana Cranage's late mother. He had a schedule of the annuity payments made quarterly for the past 7 years to the estate of the ward. The payments had been drawn by Lady Marbre as trustee de facto, and the ward had never once acknowledged them. Mr. Pedet studied the schedule for a long time. Then, in his dry voice, he told the Duke it was a remarkably neat piece of fraud, one they could likely unravel. He planned to prepare a standard chancery summons and present it to a master, who would then order Lady Marbre to produce the original document. He added that the ward, if she wished, should be present, and that he certainly wouldn't proceed without her word. "You will have her word this week," the Duke declared. Mr. Padet replied dryly, "I hope so, Your Grace. Do not place yourself in a position where you've asked a young woman to make a decision beyond her capacity. It's not her aunt she needs to fear, but what is being done in her name without her consent." "You are right," the Duke conceded. He rose. "I will bring her to you myself." That evening, he went to his mother's house in Grosvenor Square and sat by her bedside. She was worse. She had been unwell for a fortnight, her breathing growing ragged and faint in the early hours. That afternoon, she had refused to see the doctor, stating she wished to see her son instead. When he entered, she asked, "Have you spoken with her?" "Yes, in the garden, 8 days ago," he replied. "And what did he say?" she whispered. "He said there's something you should know, Mother. Her aunt has been drawing her mother's annuity for 7 years. She hasn't given her a shilling." The Dowager Duchess of Ravensgate closed her eyes for a long moment. "That woman," she breathed. "Pedet is preparing a summons," he told her. "I will bring the girl to him this week. He wants her word before he acts. You once told me I shouldn't raise her, only to let her fall. I have no intention of letting her fall. I intend to marry her." His mother opened her eyes, a light in them he hadn't seen in a year. "Have you asked her?" "Not yet. She has too little right now. I won't ask her to accept me until she has her own name in her own hand. It's not my proposal she needs first, it's her papers." "Ellis, you are a fine man," she said softly. "I am your son. Do not wait too long." "I know. After a pause, she said, "Go and fetch her then, and bring her to Padat, and don't let that woman keep her another quarter." He kissed her thin, dry hand. "I will." The next morning, he penned another brief note. This one he sent to Alice. He had judged Alice correctly. He had observed during each visit that Alice ventured out every morning, on foot, to a subscription library on Kersonen Street, accompanied by the spaniel, and remained there for the better part of an hour. He wrote to her, stating that if she cared for her cousin and could be trusted, he would be at the library at 11 on Thursday and would appreciate 10 minutes of her time. He signed only his initials. Alice was a plain, kind, timid young woman. She had lived in fear of her mother her entire life, and of her sister only slightly less. In her 22 years, she had never once acted without her mother's explicit direction. She read the note twice, sitting very still for a long moment. Then she folded it small and tucked it inside her stocking, having once read in a novel that this was the safest place to keep a letter from one's mother. On Thursday, she arrived at the library at 11, the spaniel in tow. The Duke was there, along with Rose. "Miss Alice," he said gravely. "Thank you." "Your Grace," she replied, her cheeks flushing. "I need your help," he continued. "It's for your cousin's sake. She's in some trouble regarding a settlement that is legally hers. My solicitor is prepared to act, but she must come to him." "Mama won't let her leave the house," Alice said. "I know. That's why I've written to you. Can you contrive for her to go out with you tomorrow morning, perhaps to this library or to a milliner's? She only needs to step out of the house with you. My carriage will be waiting at the corner." "Where will she go?" Alice inquired. "To Mr. Padet in Lincoln's Inn Fields. He is my mother's solicitor. He is entirely trustworthy. She will be back in 2 hours." "Mama will know she has been out," Alice said in a very quiet voice. "Yes, she will know." Alice looked down at her hands. "It will be very bad for Diana afterwards." "It will be for a day, only a day. The day after that, Diana will have a document in her own hand that will allow her to leave that house whenever she chooses. If she wishes, she may leave that afternoon. I will take her in my carriage to my mother's house." Alice, still speaking very quietly, asked, "Are you going to marry her?" "Yes, if she will have me." Alice looked up, her eyes shining. "You will be very kind to her." "I will." "Then I will do it." She did it. The next morning, before breakfast, she carried out her task in an ordinary way that aroused no suspicion. She simply told her mother at the breakfast table that she needed a new pair of gloves and would go out to the shops with Diana at 9. Her mother, who had begun to tire of her daughter's company that season, absently told her to go and return promptly. She did not look at Diana, engrossed in her newspaper. Alice and Diana went out together at 9. The spaniel came too, as it always accompanied Alice. At the corner of Mount Street, Alice squeezed Diana's hand once and turned back with the dog, as prearranged, loudly stating she had forgotten her purse and would go home to catch up with Diana. Diana walked on alone to Grosvenor Square, where the Ravensgate carriage was waiting at the corner. She was inside and away before the clock at St. George's had struck 10. Mr. Padet received her in his office in Lincoln's Inn Fields. He rose, bowed, and offered her a chair and tea. She refused the tea and sat, a small figure, in the chair. She kept her hands in her lap and her face still. She had been sitting quietly in one house or another for 7 years, and she was very adept at it now. Mr. Padet laid out the papers on his desk with quiet care. In his dry voice, he said, "Miss Cranage, will you look at these?" She looked. She saw the certified copy of the settlement, the schedule of annuity payments, the receipts, 7 years' worth, signed by Lady Marbre as trustee, never countersigned by Diana at all. She sat very still. Then, from her reticule, she withdrew a small, folded piece of paper, unfolded it, and laid it on the desk beside the certified copy. It was the copy her father's clerk had made for her at 17. The two were, of course, identical. Mr. Paddett looked at it. In a voice slightly less dry than before, he said, "You have carried this, Miss Cranage, for 7 years." "Yes," she replied. "Why did you never bring it forward?" "I did not know to whom I should bring it, and I did not know if anyone would believe me over my aunt." Mr. Paddett bowed his head briefly. "There is at least one person now who believes you over your aunt. Do you wish me to act?" "Yes. You understand that once the summons is served, you cannot remain under her roof." "Yes. Where will you go?" "I have not yet thought. You may go this afternoon to the Duchess Dogger's house in Grosvenor Square. She has been apprised. A room has been prepared." Diana was quiet. She looked at her hands. "The dagger is very ill." "She is," Mr. Paddett said. "She has, I think, been waiting to have you safe under her roof before she permits herself to be as ill as she is." Diana did not answer for a long moment. Then she said, "I will go." "Then that is settled." He rose and bowed. He stated he would prepare the summons that very afternoon and present it to a master by the end of the week. He added that he did not, in fact, believe it would come to that. "Lady Marbre," he said, "when the summons is served upon her, will very likely settle privately to avoid notoriety and produce the papers under some polite excuse. If she does not, we will go to a master, and we will win." He spoke with the air of a man who had won such cases and did not enjoy the victory. The Duke was in the carriage at the door and rose when Diana emerged. He handed her in. He did not speak until they had pulled away from the curb. Then he said, "Miss Cranage, would you be very frightened if I asked you to come with me now to my mother's house?" "Not frightened, tired," she replied. "You may sleep in the carriage. It's not 5 minutes." "I did not mean the carriage," she said. "I know what you meant." She sat quietly, her hands in her lap. At last she said, "I have not been in a grand house since I was 17. You will not be a guest at mine. You will be my mother's guest, and she is not a woman who lets a guest remain tired for long." They arrived at Grosvenor Square. The house was quiet, the steps were swept. The butler received Diana at the door as though she were a family member expected for some months. He took her cloak and announced that her Grace was in her sitting room and had inquired if Miss Cranage would come up. Diana ascended. She climbed the stairs like a woman entering a room she had once dreamed of. The Duke did not accompany her. He waited in the hall, having correctly surmised that his mother wished to see the girl alone. The dogger was in a large chair by the fire, wrapped in a fine wool shawl. She was smaller and thinner than she had appeared at tea. Her breathing was rapid, but her eyes were bright. She extended her hand and said, "Come here." Diana went and knelt beside the chair without being asked. It was an instinctive movement, older than any thought. It was what she had learned to do in her own mother's final months in the smaller house, in the smaller room, when it was just the two of them and the world was very quiet. The dogger took her hand and held it. "My dear," she said. Diana did not answer. "You have been in that house too long," the dogger stated. "Yes. You will not go back. I do not think I can. You will not need to." She looked at Diana's face for a long moment. "My son has told me he means to marry you. Do you know this?" "He has said as much," Diana replied. "And what have you said?" "That I have no drawing room in which to be asked," Diana said very softly. The Dodger gave a small, dry cough of a laugh. "You will have one soon enough. My dear, listen to me. You do not have to say yes to him this week. You do not have to say yes to him this month. He will wait. He is not a man in a hurry. But I would like, before I die, to have seen my son sit down at his own dinner table with a wife who will feed him and hold his hand and tell him when he is wrong. And I would like to have known that the woman I chose was the one he chose too. Do you understand? Yes. Go and sleep. There is a room. Betsy will bring you tea in an hour. When you are rested, you will come and read to me. I have been meaning all winter to read Cowper again, and I've quite forgotten who Cowper was." "You have not forgotten, ma'am," Diana said. "No, but it pleases me that a young woman knows he has not forgotten. Go." Diana kissed the thin hand and departed. The Duke, in the hall, asked her nothing. "Betsy will show you to your room," he said. "There is a bell if you need anything. I will not trouble you today." "Thank you," she replied, and went upstairs. Back at Mount Street, at 11, a note from Mr. Pedet was delivered to Lady Marbre by a boy from the house of Lincoln's Inn. Kuma read it in the drawing-room. She read it once, then twice. She rang the bell so violently that the bell rope came away from the plaster. She called for Diana. There was no Diana. She called for Alice. Alice appeared, quite pale, and stated that Diana had been called away to the house of a family friend, and as far as Alice knew, was not expected back before evening. Alice's cheeks were flushed with the telltale bloom of a lie. Coomer's gaze swept over her, a flicker of instant comprehension in her eyes, and then a sharp, open-palmed blow landed across Alice's face. Alice instinctively raised a hand to her stinging cheek. She didn't cry. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mama," Cosima murmured, her tone low and urgent. "You've helped her." Alice simply replied, "Yes." "You will not go out again this week," Cosima declared. Alice met her gaze. "I don't need to go out. She's safe." Cosima stood for a long moment, the note still clutched in her hand, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "Where has she gone?" she asked. "I won't tell you," Alice stated. "You will," Kuma insisted. "No," Alice replied. Priscilla had entered the room during this tense exchange, catching the tail end of their hushed conversation. She stood framed in the doorway, her face ashen. "Mama, Mama," she stammered, her small voice trembling. "What's happened?" Cosma turned, her expression shifting to the polished veneer of her drawing-room persona. "It's nothing that need concern you, my dear. A small matter of family business. Go up to your room." Priscilla's voice, barely audible, cut through the air. "Diana has gone," Kuma repeated, her voice flat. "Diana has gone." "With him," Priscilla whispered. Kuma offered no response. Priscilla lingered in the doorway for another beat, then said, "I see." She turned and walked away, not towards her own room, but down the corridor to the schoolroom. She sat at the plain deal table, a surface she had never once occupied in her life, and placed her elegant hands flat upon it, gazing at them. For the first time in her 6 seasons, she thought with stark clarity about the person she had become. She considered how relentlessly her mother had molded her towards this singular ambition. She recalled the tiny pinpricks hidden beneath Diana's sleeves. Of course, she had known about the pinpricks. Everyone in the house had known, and she had never uttered a single word. She remained in the schoolroom for a long time. Downstairs, Cosima was writing. She penned a letter to her sister-in-law, the wife of a minor country baronet, inquiring whether the family might, in an emergency, decamp to Wiltshire for a fortnight. She wrote to her banker, requesting a small advance, and to her hairdresser, canceling an appointment. In essence, she was bracing herself for what she was beginning to perceive as a brewing storm, its true magnitude yet hidden from her. Her habitual, 7-year tendency to underestimate Diana had blinded her to the fact that Diana had left her home, because, for the first time, Diana now had somewhere to go. The truth of it dawned on her on the second day, when Mr. Pettit arrived in person at 3 o'clock, accompanied by a young clerk carrying a portfolio and a bailiff at the front door. In his dry, courteous tone, he announced that he had come to serve a summons upon Lady Marbre concerning the trust estate of one Diana Cranage, spinster, of Mount Street. He offered to leave the summons with her steward if she preferred, but strongly recommended that she read it herself and consult her own solicitor without delay. Kuma read the summons. She read it standing by the mantelpiece, the paper trembling in her hand. She scanned the schedule of payments, the affidavit accompanied by a certified copy from Chancery Lane, and the names of 2 witnesses to the copy her father's clerk had made for her niece at 17. Her face turned ashen, and a fury she had never before experienced consumed her. "There has been a grave misunderstanding, Mr. Pettit," she declared, her voice regaining its drawing-room composure. "That may well be, madam. I have been withholding that annuity," she continued, "as trustee for the maintenance of my niece." "I do not doubt it, ma'am," he replied. "The court will require the receipts. It will require a full accounting. It will, I believe, ask why the ward, being of age for some 3 years, has never signed a single receipt of her own," Cosima offered weakly. "She has been ill," Mr. Pettit responded with a soft, "Ah." Cosima pressed on. "She has been of a delicate disposition. I did not wish to trouble her with business." Mr. Pettit inclined his head. "That is a great pity, and a great expense to spare her." He stated he would leave the papers, and that the hearing was set for that day fortnight. He added, however, that he did not, in fact, believe it would come to a hearing. He suggested that if Lady Marbre wished to spare the family further embarrassment, she needed only to fulfill 3 conditions. She was to produce the original settlement, she was to deposit the 7 years' income for the ward in her own name, she was to provide an account of her stewardship as advised by her own solicitor. He believed this would be an accommodation the ward's advisors would accept, and in that case, the ward would not press for costs. Cosima, her voice tinged with a resonance she hadn't used since her early widowhood, inquired, "And who advises the ward, Mr. Pettit?" "I do, ma'am," he replied. "And at whose expense?" "At mine. That is a most generous charity, Mr. Pettit." "It is not charity, madam." He bowed and departed, the bailiff following him. Cosima stood in the drawing-room, the summons a stark weight in her hand, for a very long time. She did not cry. She had not cried in 20 years. She prided herself on her cleverness. In her narrow, formidable way, she was one of Mayfair's most astute women. She grasped instantly that her position was indefensible on its merits. She also understood that her position held one remaining leverage, and it was now in her hand. The summons had revealed a great deal. However, it had not informed her that Diana was already at the Dares' residence. It had left her to surmise on that crucial point, and her surmise was correct. That afternoon, she dispatched a note, hand-delivered by messenger, to the Countess of Larkfield in Berkeley Square. The Countess of Larkfield was the Duke's aunt, Bathsheba's youngest sister. She was hosting the season's grandest ball that Saturday, a gathering to which every person of consequence and every hostess eager to be seen would flock. The invitation for Cosima and her 3 daughters had been extended 3 months prior, a standard inclusion in Coomer's second-tier social circle. At this late hour, the Countess would not have rescinded an invitation without cause. Cosmer's note was a small, meticulously crafted piece of work. It expressed, in the gentlest terms, her regret that Miss Cranage, her niece, who had been residing with the family, had recently been the subject of a minor and unfortunate misunderstanding. Coomer wished, out of pure consideration, to reassure the Countess that any potential awkwardness at the ball would be handled by the family with the utmost discretion. She hoped only for the Countess's understanding. It was a subtly barbed sentence, intended to be shown. It was Cosima at her most formidable and her most desperate. The Countess of Larkfield read it. She was a small, brisk woman, her sister's eyes gazing from her face, but none of her sister's fragility. That very morning, she had received a note from her nephew, Duke Ellis, informing her that he would be bringing Miss Cranage to the ball as his personal guest and requesting that she receive Miss Cranage in her own carriage. She read Cosma's note twice, then turned it over. "So the woman intends to cause a scene," she remarked mildly to her secretary. The secretary, who had served the Countess for a decade, replied with equal mildness, "Yes, my lady." The Countess responded, "Well, let her." She sent no reply to the note. That afternoon, she dispatched her own carriage to Duchess Dare's residence in Grosvenor Square with a message. On Saturday evening, the carriage would call for the Dares' guest, Miss Cranage, at 9 o'clock. Diana received the message in the small, quiet library where she had been reading to the Dare. She looked at it for a long time. She had been at Grosvenor Square for 8 days. Initially, she had slept for 12 hours at a stretch and eaten as she hadn't in 7 years. Several times a day, she had sat by the Dare's chair, reading her Kalpa, listening to her tales of the old Queen's court, and keeping her thin, cold hand warm beneath her own. Once, in the mornings, she had walked in Kensington Gardens on the Duke's arm. He had not asked her again, nor had he touched her hand. He had simply walked with her, pointed out the ducks, and spoken of his tenants at South Cross. Through his careful reticence, she had begun to understand precisely the kind of man he was. He was a man who did not wish to press. He would wait for her indefinitely if she asked him to. She would not ask him to. That afternoon, she had also learned from the Countess's secretary about Cosima's acid little note, and immediately grasped Cosima's intentions for the ball. She said quietly to the Countess's secretary, "Please tell her ladyship I will come." That evening, she went to sit with the Dare. "Ma'am," she said, "Lady Marbre intends to name me publicly at the ball." The Dare replied, "Yes, she would." Diana asked, "May I answer her if she does?" The Dare responded, "You are your own woman now, my dear. You may answer her as your own woman." Diana said, "I would rather not shame her." The Dare smiled faintly. "You will not need to. She will do the shaming herself. You will only need to be very plain." Diana nodded. "I will try." The Dare continued, "You will succeed. You are, my dear, considerably better at plain speaking than my son, which is fortunate. He will need someone to do it for him in the house." Diana replied, "Ma'am." The Dare then asked, "Yes?" Diana said, "If, at the ball, he asks me again, I will say yes." The Dare was silent for a moment, then said, "Good." Diana kissed her hand. The night of the ball arrived. The Countess's house in Berkeley Square blazed with candlelight. The upstairs rooms were opened into one another, creating a grand expanse. The band played from the gallery. The staircase was adorned with early roses. 300 guests filled the rooms, including 4 dukes besides the host, half the cabinet, 2 royal cousins, and a poet the Countess had recently taken under her wing. At 10 past 10, Lady Marbre and her 3 daughters arrived, resplendent in 3 new gowns. They had hired their carriage for the season, their own coachman having been dismissed the week before to economize the household. Cosma was remarkably calm. Her stratagem was prepared. She had not yet seen Diana. Her gaze swept quickly across the rooms, and Diana was not among them. A small, sharp wave of relief washed over her. Perhaps the Duke had not brought Diana after all. Perhaps he had reconsidered and left her at Grosvenor Square. Perhaps the entire scandal could still be quietly contained on terms she could bear. Then, the crowd at the entrance to the second drawing room parted momentarily, and she saw Diana on the arm of the Countess of Larkfield. Diana wore a simple gown of exquisite grey silk, perfectly tailored. Her dark hair was styled plainly, unadorned. Around her throat, she wore a single, small brooch belonging to her mother, a pearl set in a plain gold band. She had kept it folded within the smallest of her 3 books for 7 years. Tonight was the first time she had worn it. She looked utterly herself, a woman of quiet dignity. Cosma seized her opportunity. She moved across the room, her 3 daughters trailing behind her, as one does when deciding that the only remaining course of action is to hold one's ground. She stopped a step from the Countess and curtsied. In her drawing-room voice, pitched to carry to the 6 nearest guests, she said, "Lady Larkfield, how kind of you to receive my niece. Diana, dear, you must not tire her ladyship." Diana remained silent. She offered a brief curtsy to the Countess, but not to Cosma. Cosma, her smile unwavering and her tone still pleasantly warm, as befits a hostess, continued, "It is such a kindness of you, dear ladyship, to go to such trouble. My poor niece, of course, is not accustomed to society. She has been such a difficult charge upon our household these 7 years, but we have loved her. Her voice rose slightly. We have loved her as one of our own. The room around them had fallen silent. A hush had descended, and everyone within 20 feet was watching. Diana looked at Cosima, her gaze devoid of heat, of pity, of love. In her plain voice, not raised at all, yet heard by everyone in the hushed silence, she said, "You have not loved me, Mama." Cosima's smile did not falter. She replied, her voice still warm, "Diana, my dear, you are overwrought." Diana countered, "I am not overwrought. I am telling the truth. You have never loved me. For 7 years, you've collected your mother's annuity of £180 annually, yet not a shilling has ever touched my hand. You've held on to the settlement papers that are rightfully mine, denied me my own name, my own livelihood. Say what you will about me in that room, it won't be me who is shamed, but you." Priscilla, nestled against her mother's shoulder, stirred almost imperceptibly. It was the kind of subtle shift a woman makes when a truth, long unspoken, is finally laid bare, and she recognizes its stark reality. Priscilla didn't recoil from her mother, she remained rooted to the spot. Yet, she didn't reach for Cosima's sleeve or draw closer to the family. She simply held herself a small step apart, and Cosima felt it, a palpable chill entering the room. Alice was already by Diana's side. Cosima spoke, her voice betraying a tremor she couldn't quite suppress, a shade less assured than before. "You forget yourself, Diana." "No, ma'am," Diana replied. "For the first time in 7 years, I am remembering myself." The Countess of Larkfield, who had absorbed every word, inclined her head. "Lady Marbre," she said, her voice cool and measured, "my rooms are open to you and your daughters this evening, as they have been all season. However, I would suggest we speak no further of Miss Cranid's private affairs in the hallway of a ball. Diana, my dear, come." She took Diana's arm and guided her towards the ballroom. Cosima was left standing in the drawing-room doorway, her 3 daughters behind her. She stood remarkably still. In that moment, she did not cry. She would not cry in this house, in this century, but she understood, with chilling clarity, that she had lost. The Duke moved through the throng, not with haste, but with his own unhurried grace. He bowed to the Countess, then to Diana. His voice, pitched low enough for only them to hear, reached Diana. "Miss Cranage, may I have a word in the small blue room?" "Yes, Your Grace," Diana replied. He offered her his arm, and she took it. Never before had she accepted a gentleman's arm at a ball. Her hand was steady. In the past 5 minutes, she had accomplished something far more formidable than she would ever be asked to do again. Together, they crossed the ballroom, drawing the gaze of 600 eyes. No one in the room now failed to notice her. The band continued to play. The dancing, though thinned, had not ceased. In the doorway of the blue room, a couple of elderly guests who had been seated there rose politely as they approached, then exited, closing the door softly behind them without a word. They were alone. "Miss Cranage," he began. "Your Grace," she responded. "I asked my mother's permission a fortnight ago, and she granted it. I sought Mr. Paddit's counsel yesterday, and he gave it. I am asking you now." "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" A long, profound silence stretched between them. Then she answered, "Yes." "Not for the estate," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Not because we declared ourselves allies tonight. Not because of your aunt. If you say yes for any of those reasons, we will discover it later, and it will be a burden for us both. I would rather hear a no now than a yes for the wrong cause." She looked at him, her dark gray eyes remarkably steady. "I would not have said yes for any of those reasons," she replied. "I said yes because you are a man of seriousness, because you asked me plainly, and because for 8 days I have watched you not press me. And one other thing, he prompted. What is that? You have not once asked me to be other than I was in the garden. You have not brought me a fashionable gown. You have not asked me to sing. You have not asked me to walk with your friends. You have only asked me to sit with your mother and read to her, and to think. I have not been asked to think by anyone in 7 years. You will need to think a great deal if you marry me, he said quietly. I would like to, she answered. Then it is done. He did not take her hand. He bowed to her formally. Miss Cranage, thank you, she curtsied. They re-entered the ballroom. The Countess met them at the door, extending her hand and drawing Diana into the fold of her own people. She gave the Duke a look that conveyed her profound pleasure, without a single word. Cosima and her 3 daughters departed the ball at 11. They did not remain for supper, and their exit went entirely unnoticed. It is one of the small, cruel truths of a grand ball. Some arrivals are keenly observed, while others depart into anonymity. They drove back to Mount Street in silence. Cosima did not speak. Priscilla remained mute. Jemima gazed out at the passing streets. Only Alice, in the corner of the carriage, offered a solitary observation. She was very fine tonight, she murmured, half to herself. Be silent, Cosima commanded, her head not turning. Alice fell silent. The matter that followed moved with swift efficiency. Mr. Paddett called upon Lady Marbre's solicitor at 10 the following morning. The solicitor, having reviewed the summons, the affidavit, and the schedule, and having formed his own assessment of his client's prospects at a hearing, advised her to settle. She did. The settlement papers were produced in their entirety. The annuity was accounted for, 7 years of arrears, with interest calculated at the rate the master would have imposed, were deposited into an account in Diana's sole name at Coutts. Costs were waived, and Cosima's name did not appear on any of the documents. It was, as Mr. Paddett had foreseen, an accommodation. The engagement was announced in the Morning Post within a fortnight, couched in the understated, formal language the Ravensgate family reserved for such occasions. It was read in every drawing-room in Mayfair and discussed by all. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensgate, in her sitting-room in Grosvenor Square, had it read aloud to her by Diana, who sat at her feet on a low stool. The Duchess reached out her hand and rested it on Diana's dark hair. Well, she said, the marriage took place at St. George's, Hanover Square, 6 weeks later. Quietly, in the presence of the 2 families and a select circle of close friends. Diana wore a gown of white silk. It had been cut and fashioned in 3 weeks by a modiste, chosen by the Countess of Larkfield, who had paid for it herself, from her own funds in the Coutts account. She walked up the aisle on the arm of the Countess's husband, her father having passed away. She was given away formally by no one, for she had, at last, no need of such a gesture. The service was brief. She spoke her vows in her plain, steady voice. The Duke's voice, a shade rougher than usual, carried his own. The Duchess, though gravely ill, insisted on attending. Wrapped in 3 shawls, she sat in the front pew, holding Alice Marbre's hand. Alice, after some quiet negotiation, had been permitted to attend, as the sole Marbre representative. Priscilla had sent a note of decorous congratulation from Bath, where the family had retreated the day after the ball. Cosima had sent nothing. Jemima, folded very small within her sister's note, had enclosed a single line in her own hand, "Thank you for the Latin." Diana placed it within the small book of odes, where it would reside for the rest of her life. The Duchess died in October, at Grosvenor Square. Diana was with her, as was Ellis. In her final afternoon, holding Diana's hand, the Duchess said, "You will do very well. Continue to be plain. Do not learn our ways. We have had quite enough of our ways in this family." "I will not learn them, mother," Diana replied. "Good," the Duchess said. "Mother," Ellis interjected. "Look after each other," she instructed. "We will," he promised. She closed her eyes, and some hours later, in the small hours of a biting cold night, she passed away peacefully, without pain. Ellis did not weep at her bedside. He wept once, standing in the passage outside the door, his forehead pressed against the cold plaster, while Diana held his other hand. He wept for precisely the duration he had been unable to weep at his father's funeral, 5 years prior. Then, he became quiet and re-entered the room. They buried her at South Cross, in the small church on the edge of the park, beside her husband. Diana stood at the graveside in a plain black gown, her tears held back. She had learned at 17 that tears were for the onlookers, for those who enjoyed a spectacle, and she had never offered them again. But her hand remained clasped in his throughout the afternoon. That winter, they stayed at South Cross. The great house was cold, the roof leaked in 3 places, and the kitchen chimney smoked. Diana, clad in a good pair of half-boots, walked from tenant cottage to tenant cottage, a small notebook in hand. She listened, and she wrote. By April, the roofers were at work. By May, the smiths. By harvest time, the great barn at the South Farm boasted a new door. The widow at the top cottage had a warm hearth, and the herd on the West Acres had increased by 12. It was not a grand transformation. It was the quiet, diligent work of a capable mistress. No songs were sung about it. The tenants, long weary, began, slowly, to feel less so. Ellis was in residence for 3 months of the year. When he was in the country, he rode out with her, or with his steward, or alone. He applied himself to the work of a serious young man of reformist inclinations. In the small drawing room at South Cross, on the nights he was home, Diana and he sat by the fire, on either side of the hearth. She read to him what he had written for the estate. She pointed out where his argument was strong, and where it could be improved. He was, as his mother had predicted, a man who would require someone to help him articulate his thoughts. Alice came to live at South Cross in the spring. She had been unhappy at Mount Street, and even more so at Bath. She had written to Diana a small, carefully worded letter, asking if her presence might be of any use in the country. There was. Diana had begun a small school in the village for the tenants' children, and needed a woman with a steady hand to run it. Alice ran it. In that plain, necessary work, she blossomed into something akin to the person she might have been had her mother not shaped her destiny. She was no longer seen in the drawing rooms of London. She was seen every morning at 8, opening the schoolroom door for the children of her tenants. She was profoundly happy. Jemima, in due course, became engaged to a young clergyman of good family and modest means, whom she had met through Alice. She wrote to Diana at intervals, her hand improved by her study of Latin. By the end, she was a small, quiet, happy woman, much loved by her parishioners, who never guessed her origins in Mount Street. Priscilla, in Bath, spent a long time in her mother's drawing room. She remained beautiful and still possessed a certain coldness, but after the ball, a change lay beneath the surface of her beauty. At the doorway of the Countess of Larkfield's ball, she had seen precisely what her mother had made of her. She could not undo it, but she could refuse to perpetuate it. She declined 3 offers in the following year from men she did not respect, whose wealth her mother urged her toward. She eventually married a widower of 45, a Yorkshire baronet with 2 young children, whom she had met at the pump room. He was a good man. He needed a mother for his boys. He was not, she told him honestly before accepting, a man she loved. He replied that he did not need to be loved, he needed only to be helped. She accepted him and went north with him. She was not always kind to his sons, but she was, in the slow, arduous way of those who have been poorly raised and understand it, learning. Diana wrote to her each Christmas, and Priscilla replied briefly. It was not friendship, but it was not nothing. Cosima moved from Mount Street to a small house in Bath at the end of that first summer. She lived on the modest annuity Diana had, at her own quiet insistence, settled upon her. She accepted it ungraciously and never spoke of Diana by name. She lived for another 11 years, in the manner of women who cannot forgive themselves and cannot admit it. She died in her sleep of a chill, during a winter of relentless rain. Alice attended the funeral, while Diana did not. Neither woman ever regretted that arrangement. 2 years after the wedding, on a bright May morning at South Cross, Diana gave birth to a son. She named him Thomas, after her father. He inherited his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and from his very first hour, possessed his mother's steady disposition. He was baptized in the little church by the park, where his grandmother lay buried. In time, he grew into a serious, quiet boy who could read Latin at 7 and ride a pony at 4. The tenants, amongst themselves in the tap rooms, would say he was born to the place. A daughter would follow him, and then another son. But this is not their story. This is Diana's story. It concludes here, in the late summer of her 27th year, in the small parlor at South Cross, a room she had personally refitted. It was 7 in the evening, the fading light casting a honeyed glow on the west wall. Beside her, on the table, lay a letter from Alice concerning the school, and a small volume of old texts. At the throat of her plain gray gown, she wore her mother's pearl. Her arm bore no mark. She had lived at South Cross long enough that when she rolled up her sleeves in the kitchen, any marks had long since faded, vanished, and never returned. She heard him in the hall, approaching with the baby. She heard him speak to the child in his quiet voice, words she couldn't quite catch. Then, she heard the baby laugh, once, and then again, the small, round, disbelieving laugh of a tiny person who has just discovered the sheer joy of laughter. She rose, but did not move towards the door. She stood in the center of her own parlor, in her own home, in her own name, and waited. He entered and placed the baby into her arms. His smile did not reach his mouth. It was a smile learned over 8 days in Grosvenor Square, a subtle crinkling at the corners of his dark eyes. He said Diana, she replied, Ellis. There was no tension, no strain. There would be no more tension, and since that afternoon in the garden, not a single smile within that grand old family had meant anything other than what it appeared to be.